So, this week you worked on chapter 5 is it's kind of a nice little chapter. It's nothing heavy to it, was it? It wasn't too bad, was it? It's kind of nice after chapter 4, after all of the shock of chapter 4. I think the big thing was to realize that there are just 4 ingredients in a marriage that you need to be aware of, being the 4 ingredients that they listed. And then, as I suggested, page 45 through 48, focusing on security and comfort last week, this week in chapter 8 on page 88 through 91, the first thing you're going to do this week is read page 88 through 91 so that you can focus the whole week on these 2 things, courting and respecting. And they've got some sample suggestions there. Probably about once a month, my wife and I on page 89, we reminisce about our courtship. Just for the fun of it, we remember certain things. Like, I don't know if I've ever told you guys, but we met in October, we were engaged in November, and we got married in February. So it was fast. But did I tell you the story of how we met? Just a quickie. I'll give you the short version. I was a teacher at the high school here, and a fellow teacher and I, we both lived in an apartment. And we said, why don't we get together, quit living in an apartment, rent a house together? So that's what we did. And we found a house real close to the school, so it was really neat. But it didn't have a stove and it didn't have a refrigerator. So we flipped a coin to see who was gonna go get what. And I ended up looking for a refrigerator. So I looked in the newspaper, called this lady up, went over. It was Carla, my wife. I thought, wow, I think I'll ask her out while I'm here. So I offered her, she wanted $50 for the refrigerator. It was an old refrigerator. So I said, I'll give you $40 and take you out for dinner. And she said, no, I wanted 50. So I just took that as a turn down, that she was turning me down for the date also. So I left and I kept looking for a refrigerator. Couldn't find one. So I called her back a week later and I said, you sell the refrigerator yet? She said, no. I said, okay, how about I'll give you $50 and take you out for dinner? She said, okay. So that was our first date. 3 weeks later, we were engaged. 2 weeks later, we went to her parents' down in Norwalk, Sheila and Scott, you know where that is. In Southern California, we went to her parents to introduce me as her new fiance. And her father came up to me when I introduced to me, and he said, what was your last name again? And I spelled it Frady, like I always have to do. And he said, oh, I knew a Frady about the time that you and Carla were born. His name was Ned Frady, and he was my supervisor. And I told him that was my grandfather. So he actually remembered the day that I was born because my grandfather took off to go to the hospital in Pasadena, where I was born, to visit his new grandson, his first and only grandson. So 31 years later and 450 miles away, Carla and I meet on the flip of a coin. So that's our story, and I'm sticking to it. Anyway, reminiscing about courtship. We didn't have much to reminisce about. We had about 3 weeks to reminisce, 4 weeks. Actually, we had all that time up until we got married. And when we got married, by the way, if you know where Topaz Lake is, that's where we went for our honeymoon. It was like 30 miles away, and we stayed at the Topaz Lodge for 3 days because I was still teaching, she was still working. So anyway, this week you're going to focus on courting, which includes reminiscing about courtship, which includes capturing your partner for an overnight date. You're going to send flowers or gifts occasionally. It doesn't have, especially with Valentine's Day coming up. I mean, come on. You got to be getting some flowers, ladies, and some chocolate, guys. And so, and then updating your manners, return to opening your doors if you don't do that, and helping with chairs. Practice please and thank you, and review your personal hygiene, table manners, and social etiquette, etc. Okay, and then you're going to focus on respect this week also, and it's got some practical suggestions there, giving feedback privately, not in front of other people. Appreciating leadership. I appreciate what you do. Appreciating one another. Giving, in other words, showing appreciation more often. And consider both spoken and unspoken requests, giving sensitive attention to each other's spoken desires, but be aware also of those that are unspoken. And brag on your spouse in front of your family. Or as Carla one time did with my parents, they started kind of razzing me and giving me a bad time, and she stood up for me and said, "No, that's not Mark. That's not. You guys don't know Mark nowadays." And they didn't either, because at the age of 18, I went into the army. I was gone for 4 years. I stayed. I was in Berlin, Germany. I stayed in Berlin, Germany after I got out of the army, and I drove a truck for another 4 years. So I was gone for 8 years. And then I started going to the university, and so we didn't have a whole lot of contact. So anyway, brag on your partner. Okay. So with that being said, let's go back to the beginning of the chapter, page 77, which says, being free for emotional closeness. On page 79, it says, because many of us miss the opportunity to develop a feeling vocabulary as children, especially us men, and therefore entered marriage with little experience in the art of intimacy, we must develop new skills in this area. Did I ever tell you, ladies, that it behooves you to help us men in sharing our feelings with you? That if you ask us questions that are going to be yes, no answers. Did you have a good time at work today? Did you do anything special? No. Et cetera, et cetera. You keep asking questions where you're going to get a yes or no answer. You're never going to talk about feelings. So if you ask questions, you got to ask questions that can be answered and where they share their feelings. And so I think it is extremely important for you ladies to be able to know how to do that and to ask us questions that will get us, how did you feel when your boss said that to you? Okay, how did you feel when your friend invited you out to lunch or whatever? Okay, how did you feel? Ask that question a lot of us and get us to open up and share our. So then it says, developing the skill of emotional responding, which we're going to define in a second, can help end our coping lifestyles and help us to experience the joy of intimacy in our relationship. Simply stated, emotional responding means that when an emotion is expressed by one partner, an emotional response is given in return. Emotion needs emotion. Emotion needs emotion, not logic, facts, criticism, complaints, or excuses. Look at the following examples of unproductive responses, or what many refer to as a communication gap. Okay, one spouse shares the emotion, honey, I was disappointed and hurt that we didn't get to go on the date we had planned. So in return, ladies, would you like it if you got this? If you said that, if you said, honey, I was disappointed and hurt that we didn't get to go on the date we had planned, and your partner came up with logic or reasoning and said, I wouldn't have made plans for a date if I hadn't known this business trip was going to come up. It doesn't help your feelings, does it? Not one little bit. Or I couldn't have gone anywhere with this sore throat. That's just the way things worked out. That doesn't help my feelings. If I share my feelings with you and I said, honey, I was disappointed, that doesn't help my feelings. The first partner also may receive criticism, such as, you sure are being sensitive this week. I didn't think this date was going to be such a big deal. So that, that's criticizing. Let me back up to logic or reasoning for a second and give you an example of so that you can better understand this concept that when a feeling is shared, for you to respond with logic and reasoning does absolutely no good. And specifically, us guys need to hear this, okay? Scott and Sheila have had children, and they still have children. The rest of you don't, right? Matt and Chloe, you don't have any children, no. And I know Mike and Nina don't. But when and if you do have children, and this child is in bed, and you turn out the light, and the child starts crying and saying, "I'm afraid of the dark. There's monsters under my bed," and you turn the light back on and you look under the bed and you say, "There's no monsters under your bed." That's not going to help the child one little bit. Because when you turn out the light again, they're going to be afraid again. Okay. It doesn't do one bit of good to use logic and reasoning to meet someone's emotion. Child's not going to say, "Okay," and go to sleep, right? Or to say things like, "There's no such thing as monsters." Okay. I'm sorry. There's got to be monsters in that kid's head. So on page 80, in response to, "Honey, I was disappointed and hurt we didn't get to go on the date we had planned," there might be a complaint. For example, "Well, I'm hurt too. We could have spent last weekend together, but you went to your sister's instead." Or, "I know you're disappointed, but I wish you'd have told me about the dinner party before you told them we would go." Okay, again, complaining about what your partner has done in response to their emotion is not going to take care of their emotion. It doesn't do any good to respond like that. Or the fourth one is neglect, such as, "Can't we just drop it? I really don't want to discuss it anymore." Okay. I think maybe perhaps some of us have heard that statement. Okay. Or a complete lack of recognition, a lack of recognition, such as, "I think I'll go pull those weeds I've been meaning to get to." Funny story about that lack of recognition. It was probably about 10 years ago. We were having a class at our church. There were like about 6, 7 couples, and one of the couples lives in Gardnerville. And so they were coming up to Carson to go to the class, 20, 25 miles away. And on their way, they have just been taught chapter 8 the past week. And so they were working on chapter 8 all week long, understanding that you need to respond to an emotion with an emotion. And so they're driving up to the church, and the female, the wife, shares with her husband a feeling, probably something like, "I just don't feel love this week," or something like that, knowing the two of them, what she might have said that. And he this chapter evidently just did not make an impact on him, because he paused, didn't say anything, looked out the window of the car and said, "There sure is a lot of snow on the mountains still." Totally lack of recognition of her feelings. Okay. It was classic. And ever since then, she shared that with us, by the way. They talked about it, and he gave her permission to tell the class about it. So, and then I have permission to share that with you guys ever since. But when I share that at the church, when I do a class at the church, I don't give any names out. Of course, you don't know them, so no sense me telling you their names. That couple, by the way, have in the past 20 years taken the class 5 times. Now, I have several couples over the years that have taken it 2-3 times for the purpose of renewing and just reviewing, renewing and reviewing. Okay, so they took it because they wanted to. But that couple, they need it every few years. Because they don't do what they really need to do. In other words, they don't read the chapter, answer the questions conscientiously, and then have a marriage staff meeting. I would venture to say that of the maybe, let's see, 5 times they've taken it, 88 weeks each, that's 40 marriage staff meetings. I'd say they probably have done no more than 5 marriage staff meetings, because they, whenever they start talking with one another, cannot help it. They're both type A personalities, and they both cannot be wrong. Every time one of them opens their mouth, the other one has to correct them. It's amazing. Anyway, those are lessons from other people who are doing things that are not very good for you guys to not do. Okay? So, responding to an emotion with an emotion is a very good thing for you to do, and not to do the 4 things that they showed there, to use logic or reasoning or criticism or complaints or neglect. Take a look at page 84. Here's some examples of responding to an emotion with an emotion. Now, what they've got here is a statement, which is a feeling made by one of the spouses, and then the second sentence is a response, a good response of responding to an emotion with an emotion. Then there's a blank where you can write your own response during the week. Okay? The first one says, you kept your spouse waiting for over an hour. So you say to her, darling, I'm genuinely sorry for being late. I know I disappointed you. Will you forgive me? That's responding to an emotion with an emotion. Okay? The next one, your spouse shares, I'm feeling upset over not seeing more of you. And you reply, honey, tell me how I've hurt you. I want to understand what you're feeling. Again, responding to an emotion with an emotion. The third one, you enter the house and find your spouse visibly upset. You don't say, what's wrong with you now? You say, it makes me sad to see you hurting. Tell me about it. Maybe I can help. And the last one, your spouse says, I'm just worn out. So you say, sweetheart, I care about you and I want to be there for you. How can I help you feel better? Okay? Some very good samples of how to respond to an emotion with an emotion. And so that's it, unless you have any questions. It's a relatively short chapter, and I think a very good one. It's right to the point about a good way to respond to an emotion. Any thoughts? Any questions? You all, ladies in particular, agree that responding to your emotion with neglect, criticism, complaint, or neglect is not a very good way to respond to you?
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts other than that? Okay. Well, let's see. Next week. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you got my first email, but my second email. You got my second email?
Both.
Matt, Chloe. I corrected myself. I said Monday night. I don't know
But
what I
yeah.
was thinking. Tuesday night, next week, we'll meet at like the regular. Okay? Okay. Good night.
Alright.
Have a good week.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Bye-bye.